In the first video of the new series 7, we covered the origins of the first translation of the Hebrew scriptures into the lingua franca of the Hellenistic world, Koine Greek. And we've come to know this as the Septuagint 70, LXX. Question is, how did this translation impact on the legacy teachings of Jesus? As his followers went about taking his teachings to the world, following, of course, Pentecost. Now, this video will try and set the background as to show how that effort progressed. So, let's begin with a recap on the language Jesus spoke and taught in. See, while Jesus and the Palestinian Jews primarily engaged with the Hebrew texts, as we have discussed, the New Testament authors wrote in Greek, really for the diverse audiences they were dealing with, frequently drawing on the Septuagint, its wording, its vocabulary, and of course theology. Now, to what extent did these New Testament writers either directly quote or allude to the Old Testament Hebrew writings? Well, a very clear majority of scholars estimate that there are around about 340 Septuagint alignments, whereas only around just 33 for the Hebrew Masoretic text, the MT as we come to abbreviate it as. See, this applies even when the Septuagint differs from the Hebrew text, as we began to show in the last video. Now, I will cover information on the Masoretic text separately to give a better flavor and understanding of what that was. But for the moment, please accept that when I refer to the Hebrew text, I am referring to the Masoretic text, MT, unless, of course, otherwise stated. Remember also that the New Testament writers were addressing the Greek-speaking and reading audiences. And, of course, they were familiar with the Septuagint. Why? Well, it was the dominant translation among Hellenistic Jews and Gentiles. So, having got that little bit of housekeeping tidied up, we can now move on. Let's consider some examples of this comparative sort of divergent of the Septuagint from the Hebrew. Now, we covered Isaiah 7 and verse 14 in Hebrew with Matthew 1 and verse 23 in Greek. We did that in the last video. But here are a few others. Psalm 40 verses 6 to 8 of the Hebrew text says this: "Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but my ears you have opened." In the Greek Septuagint at Hebrews 10 and verses 5 through to 10, referencing this Psalm 14 verse 6 to 8, which we've just read, this is what it says: "Therefore, when Christ came into the world, he said, 'Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared for me.'" And when we go on into verse 10, "And by that we will have been sanctified through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ, once for all." Notice the theological shift from just listening to God to this Jesus body being prepared as a sacrifice. Now, this is quite a shift, isn't it? Okay, let's take another example. The prophet Amos, chapter 9 and verse 12, says this: "That they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations that bear my name, declares the Lord." Who will do this? Notice it is the remnant of Edom that will be possessed by Israel. Now, in the book of Acts, this verse is referred to in Acts chapter 15 and 16 through to 18. Luke records James as quoting from this Amos 9, 11 and 12 this way. In verse 17 and 18 of Acts, Luke reports what James is stating. Verse 17, so that the remnant of men may seek the Lord, and all the Gentiles who are called by my name, says the Lord, who does these things that have been known for ages. This is the way the Septuagint reads. It is the remnant of men that may seek the Lord. Just ponder this for a moment. Luke is here reporting that James is quoting from the Septuagint. For James to use Amos this way simply makes no sense. Let's just read a few preceding verses to get the context of Acts chapter 15 and verses 13 through to 15. When they finished speaking, James declared, brothers, listen to me. Simeon has told us how God first visited the Gentiles to take from them a people to be his own. The words of the prophet agree with this, as it is written. Notice, James is here speaking about the prophets being in agreement. But in agreement with what? In agreement with the Gentiles being brought in as Jehovah God's people. That is what the prophecy in Amos is about. Now, we have the Ethiopian official as a sort of a prime example in the book of Acts itself, where we read about it in Acts chapter 8, 35 through to 38. But this was going on for several centuries. We could go back to the father-in-law of Moses, who was Jethro. And what was he? A Midianite priest. Exodus 3, verse 1. Go check. Then we have Rahab, the Canaanite. Ruth was the Moabite who joined Israel and married Boaz. And guess what? But Rahab and Ruth were in Jesus' genealogy. Matthew 1, verse 5, Hebrews 11, verse 31. Obadiah, the Edomite, and his household. He was the palace administrator who protected God's prophets during King Ahab's persecution. 1 Kings 18, 3 and 3 to 4. Go check. Naaman, the Syrian commander. 2 Kings chapter 5. Esther, chapter 8 and verse 17. After the dramatic turn of events, let's read verse 17. In every province and every city, wherever the king's edict and decree reached, there was joy and gladness among the Jews with feasting and celebrating. And many of the people of the land themselves became Jews because of the fear of the Jews had fallen on them. So all this would have been fulfilled in Amos's prophecy. And this is what the prophets agreed with. And this is what James rightly stated. Many people from the nations did become Jewish proselytes, did they not? But when? Throughout all the nation's history. And of course, following the rebuild of the temple after exile and right down into the 1st century, CE that is, what do we find? Reading the scriptures carefully, like the Bereans, Acts 17 and verse 11, we therefore could rightly ask, why would James quote from the uninspired Septuagint instead of from the Tanakh itself, the Hebrew Bible? Especially taking account of the fact that James was head of the congregation where? In Jerusalem, and speaking in Jerusalem. Knowing what we have understood so far about James, ask yourself, is it likely that James would have quoted from the Septuagint instead of from the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible? Well, I saw no reason at all to doubt that if James did actually refer to Amos chapter 9, he would have used the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. But of course, the Hebrew scriptures don't accurately fit with what Luke is portraying, does it? Now, you will have to make up your own mind about that. However, if Luke, writing decades later, and indeed using the Septuagint, then what he says, well, could make sense. But then this leads to another question. How accurate was Luke's sense of historical recall? It seems to me Luke was making a theological point, not an historical appraisal, and he was using the Septuagint to achieve it. Let's take another example. In the Septuagint Greek New Testament of Hebrews 1 and verse 6, we read this. And again, when God brings his firstborn into the world, he says, let all God's angels worship him, the firstborn. This is clearly referencing Deuteronomy 32 and verse 43, and he's applying it in connection with Jesus. However, this is absent in the Hebrew text. Let's check that. Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 43. Rejoice, O heavens, with him, and let all God's angels worship him. Rejoice, O nations, with his people, for he will avenge the blood of his children. He will take vengeance on his adversaries and repay those who hate him. He will cleanse his land and his people. See, chapter 32 is about the song of Moses, praising who? Jehovah God. We have only to read the chapter to confirm that. The translators of the Septuagint have taken this song of Moses and they have used let all God's angels worship him and applied it to Jesus. Whereas in the Hebrew text, it clearly applies to Jehovah God. Now, scholars refer to this as a Christological interpretation, where the Apostle Peter clearly warns about private interpretations. They belong to God and nowhere in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 20. We've covered this. Now, I fully expect and understand some pushback to my analysis. Some may argue that the Septuagint fits better with the New Covenant theology than the Masoretic text, the Old Testament. So let's read together the verses in Jeremiah 31 to 34, as both the Masoretic and the Septuagint contain the same wording without any appreciable sort of variation. Verse 31, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Verse 32, it will not be like the covenant I made with their fathers when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, a covenant they broke, though I was husband to them, declares the Lord. Verse 33. But this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declared the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and inscribe it in their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Verse 34. No longer will each man teach his neighbor or his brother, saying, Know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquities and will remember their sins no more. So this is the new covenant prophecy. Let us examine it closely and try to understand what it actually means as we let the scriptures explain it. Verse 33 states that God's law would now be inscribed in people's hearts and minds. What does that mean in a practical way, and how can we be guided? Well, Jesus himself, as Luke records in chapter 10 and verse 7, gives some direction as to how the preachers he sent out would have their needs taken care of regarding food and shelter. Note carefully his instruction about who they would concentrate on when we read verses 5 through to 7. Whatever house you enter, begin by saying, Peace to this house. If a man of peace is there, your peace will rest on him. If not, it'll return to you. Stay at the same house, eating and drinking whatever you are offered. For the worker is worthy of his wages. Do not move around from house to house. All right. Verse 6. It's about accepting the hospitality from a man of peace. See, the preacher makes no demands from this man of peace, but simply accepts whatever he is being offered. Why? Because this man of peace will acknowledge the principle that a worker is worthy of his wages. And where do we find that principle? We find it in Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verse 4. Do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out grain. The direction to the owner of the ox is to recognize the principle of kindness to animals and allowing them to eat of their own labors. See, Jesus is here explaining the way that principle behind the law at Deuteronomy 25 and verse 4 is enacted in practice. Now, let us review how the Septuagint records Paul's view of this principle. Now, this is going to be a longish read, but it is important to understand how really Paul interprets this same principle at Deuteronomy 25 and verse 4, as opposed to the way Jesus explained it. 1 Corinthians 9 and those first 12 verses. Verse 1. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you yourselves not my workmanship in the Lord? Even if I am not an apostle to the others, surely I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who scrutinize me. Have we no right to food and to drink? Have we no right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles, and the Lord's brothers, and Cephas? Or are Barnabas and I the only apostles who must work for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit? Who tends a flock and does not drink of its milk? Do I say this from a human perspective? Doesn't the law say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out grain. Is it about oxen that God is concerned? Isn't he actually speaking on our behalf? Indeed, this was written for us, because when the plowman plows and the thresher threshes, they should also expect to share in the harvest. If we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much for us to reap a material harvest from you? If others have this right to your support, shouldn't we have it all the more? But we did not exercise this right. Instead, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of the Christ. See, are we here listening to the words of a preacher of God's word, or are we listening to the argument of a lawyer? See, what about Paul's attitude towards the disciples he preached to? He saw them as the work of his hands. The work of his hands, really? He's claiming some sort of ownership of their discipleship, is he not? Is this the way of the Christ? What do you think? Because you'll have to work that out for yourself. What this all illustrates is the difference of a law written in our hearts as opposed to the same law written on a tablet or on a piece of paper. Is this what the new covenant at Jeremiah 31:33 to 34 is about? Well, I believe it is. And that is why I feel so passionate about trying to understand what Jesus actually taught. However, this is there is one interesting little sidebar. What Paul acknowledges in verse 5. Just wait for this. Have we no right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? See, Paul is here confirming that James, Simon, the Zealot, and Jude were the brothers of Jesus and apostles appointed by him. Mark 3, Matthew 10, Luke 6. He's confirming our understanding. Now, I really do sort of feel that we should conclude at this, but um, before we go on, let's just think about the way the congregation um, began to burgeon in the first century, after Pentecost. That's what we're going to be examining. And along with it, of course, the teachings of ones like James and Peter and John and Paul and others. So until then, thank you very much and see you again.